Well, a part of today's lesson that E.J. read so well comes up in the lectionary text later in November of this year, but I think the whole of Judges 4 is better heard during Women's History Month. The core of the story comes from a poem in Judges 5, believed to be perhaps the oldest story in the Bible, and as such has resonated with God's people for eons. It can speak to us too, but it needs a little unpacking. First, in the ancient Near East, women were diminished and oppressed by patriarchy, so it's astonishing that in the oldest of biblical times, elite and non-elite women are remembered as having power and respect, leading armies and generals, and saving God's people. Women were allowed opportunities to be heroic and were heralded and recorded as heroic. This ancient story speaks volumes as to the real value, worth, and respect God has for women and that God's people should have. The story's been passed down and women upheld and honored not only because Deborah and Jael were heroic, but because women are in reality upheld and honored by most friends and family, even if not by patriarchies. The story tells us women can be leaders and heroes and honored and respected and should be. And we know that to be true. So does God. And here it is, embedded in the oldest part of the Bible. And I mentioned last week that before Israel was led by kings, the Hebrew people had leaders called judges. After Moses and Joshua, and before Saul and David, were told in the book of Judges about a series of heroes who lead and help the people. Basically, the judges are people who show different types of leadership skills in the pre-monarchy times of Israel. As the Anchor Bible Dictionary notes, quote, the title judges reflects a public activity and or office of the leaders, especially in a time of hardship or oppression, end quote. And in our story, we can hear that Deborah, while not royalty, is close to full leadership as can be. She's a prophetess, a military leader, a decision maker, and a law judge. And Deborah is the only judge in the entire book of Judges who does all those things, and she's the only prophet among them. And Deborah is notably shown as a very strong woman with no negative connotations to that. She leads in a time of crisis. The Canaanites are well-armed enemies. They're led by a capable and feared general, Sisera. It's a time when able people from any strata of the culture were allowed to contribute to the community's survival, and Deborah has surfaced to the top. She's the one the Hebrews came to for trusted leadership. She's who successfully commands the community response to this awful military threat. The story is awesome alone in conveying the message that when a community is allowed to rely on a woman to use her God-given gifts, everyone in the community benefits. As I mentioned, our reading from Judges 4 is based on the very old version of the story found in Judges 5, a poem that Deborah sings. Judges 5 is believed to have been written shortly after the real battle way back in the 12th century BC. One of the oldest, if not the oldest story in the Bible, remembers and records a woman playing a major heroic leadership role. And if that's not enough to get excited about, the story does not just lift up and honor a Hebrew female leader, Jael, an alien Canaanite woman, a low life to the culture, is also held up as valued and heroic. Indeed, it is into her hand that the enemy is delivered to fulfill Deborah's prophecy in the story. Jael's story is remarkable and different than Deborah's. Surprisingly, Jael has no lofty status in the culture. She's the wife of Heber the Kenite, a friend of an enemy, oppressor of Israel. And those hearing the story way back when would have known too that Jael's role as a wife included setting up tents. She knows how to drive tent pegs. And as a wife, she would also be expected to provide hospitality by greeting visitors and offering food and place to sleep, as she does in the story for Sisera. And there's also often present awful sex object mistreatment and abuse of women, akin to what our nation is plagued with and has been plagued with. Going back to Deborah for a minute, Deborah, the Hebrew judge, proves her mettle, wielding the same power that men are given: allegiance, respect, leadership, and military strength. She's a superhero. When she's given the superpowers men are allowed to have. In contrast, Jael matches, maybe even one-ups that by proving her mettle, wielding only the limited powers that the Canaanite clan, like patriarchies throughout history, have allowed women. Homemaking skills. And patriarchies have tragically also required women to give as they are asked, or demanded, or forced. And in the story, Jael offers Sisera what men in power expect from women: seductive comfort, a blanket, comfort food like warm milk, and doing what he requires. Once Sisera gets what he wants and is lulled to security and sleep, Jael kills him in a dreadfully violent fashion, using the skill of a peg pounding that women in that nomadic, tent-centered home life acquire. It's remarkable that the story as a whole can be understood to purposely praise a non-elite woman and an alien enemy for cleverly finding a way to use what skills she was allowed to have to beat the brains out of the enemy, literally and figuratively. She outsmarts him with nothing but rudimentary skills. Jael uses non-superpowers to do what no male general or warrior in hand-to-hand combat could do. She conquered Goliath, a Goliath of a man, Sisera. And I use the word Goliath, the name, to bring to mind David, who as a small teen pulled off a similar victory with just a slingshot, right? David also victoriously used what limited skills he had in combat. Jael did it first, before David, and in close quarters. The story, as I said, is compelling. Sisera, a glorious general, is defeated on the battlefield by an elite female commander. He then evades the male powers and warriors of Israel on the ground, only to be captured by a non-elite woman who was able to dispatch him in hand-to-hand combat. And I know that's powerful all on its own, but I distrust the patriarchy when it comes to what women and other non-elite women did and can do. And so I wonder, and I like to think that maybe the original historic event took place in a time when women had direct leadership and were allowed to do battle and acts of heroism in the defeat of an enemy. And the story actually suggests this, even evidence. And it makes me wonder if perhaps Deborah might actually have been the general in command from the start. But in the retelling, the patriarch washed that part out, it being too much to admit a woman was fully in charge of men in an army. And this is a bit more fanciful, way more fanciful on my part. I wonder too if perhaps Jael was a female warrior who felled Sisera on a battlefield. Or maybe even Deborah and Jael acts were actually performed by one woman who also acted as a judge. And in a later, a male-dominated system altered the story so that women would not get the idea that all on their own, they too could be glorious leaders and defeat men in supposedly man's world. And I'm not saying that's the real story. I'm saying it would not surprise me in the least if it were. Especially since the older version in Judges 5 has Jael defeat and kill a standing up, not lying down and prone Sisera. And the layers added with a nap and blanket and milk cast Sisera in a humiliating little child image curled up asleep and more easy to kill than a standing up, able to fight warrior that Judges 5 suggests. By the time Judges 4 is written, the story is already being refashioned to make Jael's feat less manly. So I wouldn't put it past a patriarchal culture to have also refashioned the story in order to belittle an enemy male general while lessening a female victory in battle. And whether the story was as told or something more as I imagine, we'll never know. What we do know is that power elites in male-dominant cultures treat women as second-class, lesser beings, unable to lead and unable to be equal to or best men, and also as primarily their sex objects, their breeders and servants. And we know that we have this very ancient Bible story that, when examined, defies the legitimacy and validity of that mistreatment. Indeed, our lesson today can be heard to flat out undermine the patriarchy by honoring females as capable leaders and courageous heroes and equals to men, and not as their sex objects and servants. When given a leadership role, women are at least as capable as men to do it. And our lesson today evidences God made it so. God let it happen. Deborah's part in the story is Exhibit A in the evidence that this is true. It is a story which has been placed before God's people for thousands of years, proving women's worth. And Jael's part in the story is Exhibit B. She evidences that it's not just women that are allowed to be elite and leaders that are able to be equal to or best men. Jael's amazing part in the story makes it clear that women of any stature or class can be capable as men to get what needs to be done. Our lesson today evidences God made it so. God let it happen. You see, women are of equal value as men, period. God's people need to recognize that, because God does. And let me close by asking, who in the story shows us how men in the culture and the male culture itself should act towards women? Barak, General Barak, right? He is a male general who's not afraid to go to a capable woman and seek and obtain her God-given gifts for leadership. And tellingly, Barak is not afraid to let the credit go to a woman. When Deborah says Sisera will be delivered into the hands of a woman, typically people hear that to mean Deborah, but it literally ends up meaning Jael. God ups the ante as the story unfolds with the unexpected evidence that women of all levels of society can do supposedly man's work. And so we can hear General Barak is acting as the hands and the feet and the voice of God by being what we call today an ally for women. He has this great attitude of not letting his male ego or patriarchal nonsense of the culture get in the way. Deborah commands his help. He wants the job done right, and he lets the best person do it. Gender's not a factor in his decision. He doesn't even care if deserving women, the people who do the job, get the credit. What matters is the result. And the result is Barak works with Deborah to defend the Hebrew people from a Canaanite king who has ruled over them for 20 years. And that rule is broken by men and women working together, using their God-given gifts while they answer God's call to treat each other respectfully and honorably, not as objects or servants, not as property. It's a good lesson that can obviously still teach us today. And may all God's people continue to learn from it. Amen.